you everybody for joining us on the National Health Council 6th in our webinar series on clinical outcome assessments. I'm Elizabeth Earline. I'm Senior Director of Research and Programs at the National Health Council, and I'll be just providing some introductory remarks and introducing our speakers. So again, the topic for today's webinar is measuring patient experiences, distinguishing between patient-reported outcomes, PROs, and patient preferences. So I wanted to just start off with a couple of quick housekeeping items. Please make sure that you're muted during the call. We've muted everybody on entry, but please make sure that you don't unmute yourself. The other housekeeping item is that we're going to be using the chat function on WebEx to accept questions for the speakers, and we will be taking those questions at the end of the presentation. And also, this presentation will be recorded and it will be archived on our website after today's call. So next slide, please. So just to remind everybody that this is a National Health Council webinar, and these are our patient group members at the National Health Council. Next slide. So just to provide a quick outline for today's call, first we'll do a quick review of the objective for today's webinar. We'll review the definition of clinical outcome assessment and what falls into the umbrella of a clinical outcome assessment. Then we'll introduce our two speakers for today, Pauline McNulty and Bennett Levitan. And first, Pauline will introduce patient-reported outcomes, then Bennett will introduce patient preferences, and we'll also be focusing on how the two are different but complementary to one another. Then we will do question and answers. So remember to please submit any questions that you have through the chat function. And then finally, we will be announcing the May topic, as well as the date and time for that webinar. Next slide, please. So again, the objective for today's webinar is to introduce to patient group audiences the differences between patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences. And we know that these two are often confused with one another, and so we wanted to make sure that, that we provide resources to help everybody with that confusion. So next slide, please. So just briefly to review what a clinical outcome assessment is. Again, the formal FDA definition is that it's something that measures a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effects of a disease or condition on how the patient functions. So essentially, a COA tells you something about how a patient feels or functions. And then when we think about the COA umbrella, we're talking about 4 different types of measures. We're talking about patient-reported outcome measures, clinician-reported outcome measures, ClinROs, observer-reported outcome measures, OBSROs, and then performance outcome measures. And so at the NHC, we've launched a series to bring everybody up to speed on clinical outcome assessment, since it's going to be such an important part of FDA's patient-focused drug development program, in particular with the forthcoming guidances. So on our website, we have archived all of our past webinars, and we're also having corresponding blogs. So feel free to check those out if you'd like more of an introduction to sort of COA umbrella. But I'll move now to introduce our speakers for today so that we can begin the presentation on how PROs and patient preferences are complementary but distinct from one another. So I'm pleased to really introduce 2 experts on these topics. Dr. Pauline McNulty is Vice President of Global Market Access in the Global Commercial Strategy Organization at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which is part of Johnson & Johnson. She's responsible for ensuring that the patient perspective is appropriately incorporated into global drug development programs through measurement of patient-reported outcomes. And we also have Bennett, Dr. Bennett Levitan, who's Senior Director of Benefit Risk Assessment, also at Janssen. And he is also an expert on patient preferences. He introduced state-of-the-art patient-focused benefit risk assessment to Johnson & Johnson. He's been responsible for numerous benefit risk and patient preference studies for regulatory submissions, as well as health authority advisory meetings, and is also involved in a number of initiatives around the world. So with that, I will turn it over to Pauline and Bennett to go ahead with their presentation, and then we will come back with to questions and answers at the end of the presentation.
Thank you. This is Bennett Levitan and
Pauline McNulty.
And we wanted to thank NHC and the audience for providing us an opportunity to share some thoughts on patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences. And we thought we might start with a sort of cute, motivating example. So imagine your wealthy relative has passed away, and you get this huge inheritance, and you could finally create that one-of-a-kind restaurant you've always wanted. And you want totally novel foods, brownies with kale and bacon, veal-flavored ice cream with tofu. And you also want a totally novel-looking restaurant, layout, decor, setting, uniform, service. And you got money, but you don't have an infinite amount of money, and you got to get it right. So are people going to love what you're making? Will they tolerate or love your new restaurant? Well, you can't ask people what they think about this type of food because it doesn't exist. They could tell you what they think of the ingredients, but they'll never give you the experience right. You need the equivalent of a patient-reported outcome to understand how people will react to this novel food. However, for the restaurant layout and decor and so on, you can't build 20 different versions of the restaurant. You get to build one. And you can't wait till you build it to see how people react. You need to do something akin to a preference study for people to tell you what they think about different types of restaurant layouts and so on. This is an example where you need both a pro and a preference approach to make these decisions. And that's actually going to be one of our themes, that pros and preferences are different ways to get different types of information from patients, different but complementary. So we did that example. We'll show you a little bit about where these type of items fit into patient-focused drug development. Then we'll go through patient-reported outcomes, patient preferences, what they are, why we do them, and how we do it, and then takeaways and future directions leading into Q&A. So we'll start on the larger scale. So patient-focused drug development is this huge initiative. It's worldwide, but focusing on the FDA. In good part, it began with PDUFA 5, where the FDA began conducting, I think, about 24 meetings with patients for a half day or a full day on specific diseases, and they were called patient-focused drug development meetings. And they were very valuable, and they continued under PDUFA 6 and 21st Century Cures, where FDA is creating a whole series of guidances in patient engagement and patient-focused drug development and benefit risk over the next few years. And this collaboration with stakeholders is very serious. The FDA knows there's a lot of expertise outside the FDA in patient engagement, and they're talking to industry, regulators, and patient groups in academia to get a lot of feedback on these guidances. It's not just the FDA who's running these type of meetings. On the bottom left, the FDA actually has created a mechanism where patient groups can run their own patient-focused drug development meetings that FDA can potentially attend and expand the work that was done initially under PDUFA 5. Now, part of this involves expanding what they mean by patient experience data. That's the new term, patient experience data. And it includes a wide variety of information about or that comes from patients. And we're going to focus on two of those, patient-reported outcomes and patient experience data. Patient preference data. Now, if you talk with the head of CDER, Janet Woodcock, she says patient-focused drug development is really meant to give the patient's voice in both development and the evaluation done by the FDA. Patient experience data can be collected by pretty much anybody who has access to patient information, and it talks about how the people experience with the disease and the treatments from it. Patient-reported outcomes and preference studies are two different ways of capturing the patient experience, and they fall under patient experience data. Now, part of what's happened is that as a society, we've gone from having a small number of people who are the experts to recognizing that people are, in many ways, their own experts. And this cartoon kind of makes it clear. In this cartoon, it's the physician who knows everything and telling the patient what their subjective experience is like, and that's changed.
So I'm going to just talk for a moment about what a PRO is. As in the previous illustration that Bennett had up there, we had a person who is being told by the doctor that they will determine how their back is bothering them. But in reality, there are many things that are important to patients who have a particular disease or a particular condition. And one of those things that's important to them is to be able to describe how it is that they feel and how they're able to function. And who's best to be able to tell you how they feel or function but the patients themselves. Therefore, we talk about patient-reported outcomes. And the definition of a patient-reported outcome from the FDA is that it's a report by the patients themselves about how their health status is, and it is not interpreted by anybody else except for the patient. They give the response. And so simply put, it's the patient that reports how they feel or how they function. And one of the things that I would like to point out here is as we go through this webinar, part of what we're trying to do here is to describe to you what patient-reported outcomes are and what patient preferences are, and for you to begin to see the similarities and the differences. And one of the differences that I will point out is that a PRO is an outcome that can be measured either in absolute terms. So, for example, if you're in a clinical trial and you're at the start of the study, you can find out from patients by asking them questions how severe a symptom that they may have is. And then at the end of the study, you may be able to find out what the change is from baseline. So those are outcomes that you can actually measure. The preference, as Bennett will go through, is not an outcome measure.
For patient preferences, the FDA definition is rather of a mouthful. It's qualitative or quantitative assessments of, I'm going to simplify it, the relative importance to patients of actual treatments, alternatives, or the properties of those treatments, the attributes that differ amongst the different health interventions. Now, that's hard to unpack, but more simply, preferences can measure what matters to patients, how much it matters, and what trade-offs patients are willing to make between either treatments as a whole or the benefits, harms, and other aspects of treatment. And we're going to say patient preferences throughout, but it can easily be the preferences or judgments of parents or caretakers or even physicians, depending on the nature of the illness and, for example, whether you're dealing with a child who's not able to do these type of surveys. And there are a variety of methods that we'll mention later, but what's important to understand is that you don't necessarily have to experience the treatment here. This is describing how you might react to the benefits and harms of a treatment that may not exist, which is also one of the main differences between preferences and probes. Preferences can describe trade-offs in the patient's mind for things that have yet to be designed. And that's actually one of the reasons it doesn't really work to use a preference typically as an outcome measure. Now, preferences and patient-reported outcomes are not the same. It's probably obvious at this point. Both are reported by patients, but a PRO is an outcome measurement based on the status of the patient's health condition, and nobody else is going to interpret the raw data. And a preference is a measure, say, of the relative importance of treatments or the benefits, risks, and treatments, regardless of whether the treatment currently exists. And the links below give you some more details on those definitions. The FDA actually is interested in both of these. And you could see this in a new document or change to a document they have. the multidisciplinary review document, which you can look up for approved drugs, has a new section called Patient Experience Data. And you can see there's a whole section on clinical outcome assessments, including PROs, and a section for patient preference studies, either those done within the trial or submitted, or scientific publications done outside. So this is a new thing for the FDA, and it's basically the FDA telling the audience or sponsors and patient groups, we welcome this type of information and we expect to see it in part of your submission. So what we're going to do now is go into first pros and then preferences in more detail.
So with the PROs, questions that we can ask at this point are, why do we measure PROs, and who are we measuring them for, and how do they use them? And then we'll talk a little bit about how PRO instruments are developed. And I hope to illustrate some of these ideas through examples. So why do we measure PROs in clinical trials? This gives you an overview of what we do. So we start out, and what we want to be able to do is to measure the patient's perspective using PRO instruments that have been developed that have good psychometric properties. And these instruments should be accurately reflecting how a patient feels and functions. And why do we do this? We do this because we want to better understand how the disease or treatment intervention is impacting the patient. And then we also want to find out what outcomes, what treatment outcomes are most important to patients. When we're able to measure these things, then we have output. And the PRO data that we have as output can be used for medical decision-making, and they can be used by different stakeholders. And let's take a look at the different stakeholders who use PRO data for decision-making. So there's a diverse group of stakeholders, starting with health authorities. And then there are the health technology assessments, or the value assessors in the U.S., the payers, the providers, the patients themselves, and their families and caregivers. And so the concept here is that the patient-reported outcomes are being used by these different groups, different decision-makers for their own needs. And one of the challenges that presents is that the stakeholders may have different requirements. They're looking at things from their position, and that means then that you have to be able to try and satisfy all of the different stakeholders, which becomes difficult. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about the fact that the stakeholders have different requirements and specific requirements. And if we look at the health authorities in the U.S. with the FDA and in Europe with EMA, there are guidances that have been put out. In the U.S., we have the 2009 guidance, but as Bennett has talked about, we are in an era of a lot of change and a lot of guidances coming out of the FDA under the PFDD initiative, with an expectation of a revision to that 2009 guidance to come out by next year. In Europe, we have similar initiatives going on. We do have a reflection paper around health-related quality of life that was issued many years ago in Europe, but a lot of activity around patient-focused drug development and PROs and COAs specifically in Europe as well. Aside from the regulators, we have the health technology assessment organizations, or the value assessors, and they have their own criteria for the way that they are going to review the PRO evidence, because with the regulators, what they are doing is they are looking at the safety, efficacy, tolerability profile of the product, and they have to make decisions about whether to approve a drug or not. And the patient-reported outcomes can add to that information as they make their assessments and their decisions about whether to approve a product. With the health technology assessors, they're making decisions about access for patients to drugs that are then used by the payers as to whether they're going to reimburse or not. And one example would be Germany, where they have a set of criteria that they use to review the evidence that's submitted to them. And it includes quality of life, health-related quality of life. And it is very important to have the information for an organization, the organization in Germany that does that evaluation, which is the GBA. If you don't have that information, you're not likely to be successful in terms of being able to get a product assessed positively. And similarly, in Japan, on the right side, health-related quality of life data is recommended wherever possible. Specifically, they would like to see Japanese data. So this is an example of an FDA label for a product called Hemlibra. And what I wanted to show here is there's a section in the label in the USPI. It's in the clinical study section 14. And this is where any PRO data is likely to be shown in a U.S. label. It is possible that PRO data might appear in the indication section of the label, but most commonly it's going to be in the clinical studies section. And this example shows that a PRO was used in these hemophilia patients to determine whether and how much improvement was seen in the patients who took the drug over the course of this trial. And because there was improvement for the patients who were in the Hemlibra arm, this information was then put into the USPI. So it's one of the sources that patients can look to see if there is evidence that's available around the patient-reported outcomes for a product. Clearly, one of the things that sponsors do is also publish information, so publications are another source of information to be able to see the PRO evidence. So turning to talking about the development of a PRO instrument, what you want to be able to do is to measure things that are important to patients. And so it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You have to put the pieces together of being able to understand the disease and the condition, so you do a literature review. You talk to clinical experts, you get input from them. But most importantly, the patient voice is a key component of the start of PRO instrument development. You need to talk to patients. You need to do focus groups. You need to interview them to be able to understand from them what's important to them with regards to how they feel and function with the particular condition that they have. And caregivers and families are also important in terms of the contributions that they can make to figure out what is important. So just talk for a moment about the fact that developing a PRO instrument there's a process that is associated with it that is methodologically rigorous. And you need to step through the pieces to start with patients and get information from them with regards to what's important to them about how they feel and function. And then you need to be able to take the themes from that, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you have reached a point where there are no new ideas coming up from patients, and eventually you're going to end up with items that you can put together. So this is putting that into a more holistic and visual representation of showing that we start with things like the literature review. We do the concept elicitation. We talk to patients. We talk to caregivers. We talk to families. And we are doing our due diligence to get to the point where we are able to generate those items, and we're able to then put together a draft instrument, and then we do cognitive debrief where we go back to patients and make sure that what has been put together in terms of a draft instrument makes sense to them and get their input, and we change things. Then we go through the quantitative parts of the development of an instrument, do the psychometric validations, test the instrument out in studies, and then eventually we will have an instrument that can be put into our later trials, into our phase 3 trials, and then we will do the analysis, the interpretation, make submissions, and we'll have the regulatory review, and potentially the PRO data, as I talked about, might appear in the product's label, but most certainly the information will be published. And I'm going to end my piece just with an example of PROs in psoriasis and showing, measuring what matters to patients. So on the left-hand side, you start out with the concept elicitation, and these are quotes from psoriasis patients in the qualitative research. For example, cracking would be almost a sore place where the skins come apart and it really hurts. So you go from all of that concept elicitation through the iterative steps. You have an instrument, you end up with a PRO instrument such as the one shown here called the Psoriasis Symptoms and Signs Diary. You include that into your clinical trials, and you measure how patients are doing from the time they enter a study over the course of the study, and at the back end, then you have the output, and you can then determine what improvements have taken place for those patients with the treatment intervention that was given to them. And as you would hope, that the treatment is an approved treatment over what's available, and that patients are doing better.
All right, so now we're going to switch to patient preferences, why we measure them, how we design them and use them. So why you would do a preference study depends very much on who you are and the context. So if you're a patient group, you may want to convince industry of the market for a new drug, or convince regulators about what level of risk is acceptable. Like if I'm going to get a certain benefit, if my migraines are going to be relieved to this degree, how much risk of a particular side effect is acceptable. Or convince health technology assessors or payers that a drug will have a high uptake rate and cost effectiveness and should be reimbursed. Or if you're a regulator, your chief interest is input for scientific opinion. And that might manifest as how much risk is acceptable for patients for a given benefit, much like I mentioned before. But also, regulators take into account quite a bit of heterogeneity. Preferences are clearly not the same amongst the population of patients, and sometimes there may actually be definitive subgroups where different groups of patients would make totally different decisions just based on their personal preferences. And regulators really need to understand that. Ultimately, regulators do have to make a benefit risk assessment, and they have to defend it. It becomes a public issue. And so if preferences can help them make a transparent and defensible decision, it's valuable. Now, the HTA or payers for reimbursement, it considers similar issues, but they'll also think about outcomes that are not benefits and risks, like cost, for example, that can be included in their analysis. And they're going to care about like patients' uptake rates for cost-effectiveness analysis, because ultimately that kind of information gets used to decide if they're going to reimburse. Now, industry considers almost the same type of issues, but from a somewhat different perspective. And I have it listed here as bullets, but I'm going to show it on the next slide in the context of a development timeline. So in the middle, I'm showing you the development chevron starting from the beginning of late development in phase 2. Now, patient preferences are used all the time to decide, is it worth making this product? Some measure of commercial viability and patient needs. That's not necessarily connected to development and benefit risk considerations. That's really marketing kind of issues, commercial considerations. But getting more into development, preferences will help you with trial design. So what endpoints do patients care most about? So, for example, in the rare disease, we don't have decades of experience studying it. And there are examples where a preference study in a rare disease helps figure out what your primary efficacy endpoint should be in the study. Or what level of those endpoints, what size change in an endpoint is critical to patients. That's critical for trial statistics and particularly helpful when you have new endpoints that haven't been looked at for a while. Strategy. I'm going to say what are the requirements for development success. And to be able to do that, to say what it means for my company to succeed in development, I need to understand how important benefits are compared to one another and compared to risks. When it comes to defending the benefit risk of my drug, I'm going to need to know things like how much risk would patients be willing to tolerate for a given benefit, or switch it around, how much benefit is required for a given level of risk. As I move towards approval and post-approval, I'm going to care about that heterogeneity issue. So patients may vary in the properties, and it may just be an amorphous blob, or there may be distinct subgroups of patients. And that's not just important for a company, that's important for the health authorities. Because just like you might approve for people with certain demographic or diagnostic criteria, eventually we may approve based on certain preference criteria. And then post-approval, you're going to care a lot about differences between stakeholders or about individual preferences. And that gets into shared decision-making. And I'll show you an example where those differences can become interesting. In fact, it's right here. So this is an example of the results of a preference study, which perhaps has been somewhat abstract for you so far. It's for anticoagulants used in atrial fibrillation. So in atrial fibrillation, your heart's not beating properly. The abnormal blood flow can cause clots to generate. It can go to your brain and cause a stroke or death. It can go into your coronary arteries and cause a heart attack. So you use an anticoagulant to lessen the chance of clot forming, but that can cause bleeding. And what you see on the left are the different benefits and risks associated primarily with clots and bleeding. And we did this survey in both physicians and patients in the U.S. And what's fascinating is that physicians regarded death as worse than disabling stroke, while patients regarded disabling stroke as worse than death. And the survey doesn't address why. You can make up your own explanation. But what's interesting to imagine is the value judgments on the left potentially could lead you to a different decision than the value judgments on the right. And this is an example of where different stakeholder views can help explain why people disagree. It won't make them agree, but you'll understand what's behind it. Now, how do you assess preferences? Well, there are a lot of approaches. It's an entire textbook, or really a career. They're both qualitative and quantitative approaches. I'm showing you here a quantitative one. And these methods are very different in how hard they are to design, how hard it is for a patient to do them or interpret the results. They also vary a lot in the cost and time. It's a field that keeps moving. This is an interesting one. It's actually rather famous. This is looking at people who have Alzheimer's and asking what trade-offs they'd be willing to take for a treatment. So you see on the top in option A 7-year timeline for people with Alzheimer's. It's a hypothetical. It's not real. But if the treatment did work, you'd have 3 years, actually this is without treatment, 3 years mild symptoms, 2 years moderate, 2 years severe, and no change in your baseline risk of stroke or brain swelling, which we won't define. And everything in the survey is defined before someone sees this part, so mild and moderate and brain swelling are all defined before. Now in option B, you just said there is a treatment. It'll give you 1 more year of mild symptoms and 1 year less of severe symptoms, which is good, but there's a 25% increased chance in stroke. And you ask, which do you prefer, A or B? Now, when someone does these surveys, they get probably 10 different of these types of examples with different degrees of benefit and different degrees of harm, and it goes into a model. The results give you things like what we saw before, but I'm going to show you a different type of result called maximum acceptable risk. So this is really an important question. If I give you a treatment and it causes side effects, at some point the side effects are just going to occur too much in frequency and severity, and you won't want to do it. You just refuse to accept it. And that's kind of behind FDA benefit risk decisions. So you could see here, if I give you 1 year improvement from moderate symptoms to mild symptoms, people would take a 5% chance based on the survey of death or a permanent severe disability due to stroke. And as you move to the right and the benefits get larger and larger, if you essentially halt Alzheimer's in the 7-year time frame, people would take up over a 30% chance of death or disability from stroke. And that's gigantic. No one would ever be comfortable approving such treatment. But it shows you how afraid people are of Alzheimer's. But this also shows you how you could elicit information that would be surprisingly important. So there are many other methods. I'll show you just one example of a simpler one called best worst scaling. In this one, you show people a whole bunch of properties, attributes, and you ask which one is most important to treat, which is least important to treat. And you can see this is obviously an easier example to do than the prior one. And you show people different combinations of 5 out of a larger list and keep asking which is important to not, least important to treat. And eventually you'll put it into the math and you'll get results similar to the ones we looked at before. So I just wanted to give you a flavor that not everything is this type of approach, which is called discrete choice experiments or conjoint analysis. So how do you design these? Well, that also is a career. You start by asking, what is your question? What do you want to know? Who do you want to know it from? And how does it depend on, what properties do you want to know how it depends on? And this is where, depending on your needs, you'll immediately engage with patients, do something akin to concept solicitation, or sometimes you pretty much know what the ingredients should be, in which case you start with clinical experts and physicians. You then break down what are the particular benefits and risks or other properties that go into your trade-offs. Like, do I have strokes? Or do I have disabling stroke and non-disabling stroke? Do I have major bleeding and mild bleeding or just bleeding overall? And you have to ask, how do I define them in the survey? Because if you have 200 to 400 people do one of these, everybody defines stroke differently. You have to find a way of defining it so everybody goes in and is level set. You have to ask what type of survey, and I showed you 2 instruments, is appropriate. Not everybody is appropriate for some of the more complex surveys, and not every question would be addressed with some of the simpler ones. What sample size and what other information you need to know. For example, your experience with Alzheimer's, like if you cared for someone in your family with Alzheimer's, will clearly impact how much risk you'd be willing to take. So you need to know that. Once you've roughed out the survey, you pre-test it. And this is somewhat similar to cognitive debriefing. So no matter how you design the survey, with physicians alone or with patients, you need to ask, is it really going to work the way I think it is? And almost always, there are multiple rounds of redesigning the survey at this point. Then there's the actual analysis of relative importance or maximum acceptable risk and subgroups like I began to show before. Now, does this stuff make a difference? Well, it's a newer field in the regulatory context than others. So it's young, but it is beginning to have an effect. So the first one was for a obesity device that the devices part of FDA, CDRH, approved in 2015. It was sort of like a pacemaker for your gut, and it had 2 endpoints that were defined in the statistical analysis plan that had to be met. It missed one of them a little bit. Well, it happened to be that the FDA did a preference study of a pilot in obesity devices, and it was spot on for assessing this problem. And as you can see in the underline area, it was used to help inform the decision. And this is the first ever documented regulatory decision that was influenced by a preference study. There's one that's relatively new. I don't have details on it on the slide, but there's a home dialysis machine. And the FDA was uncomfortable with it being used by a patient alone without someone around in case there was a rare side effect. Well, the FDA and the sponsor worked together. They did a preference study, and it showed how much risk of that rare side effect at home, well, not side effect, machine problem at home would be tolerable. And it turned out it was overwhelmingly obvious that patients would be comfortable using it at home alone. This last one is actually fascinating. It's a little different than the preference surveys I've shown you so far. So a drug called Rituxan had a preference study as a primary endpoint. And this is unusual. It's very rare that a preference question be used as an endpoint, but it was. They let people try both an intravenous drug and a subcutaneous version of the drug in a crossover trial. They tried both. And then they answer the preference question as the main input. And this led to something that was never seen before. The drug label had this patient experience section. And this is the first time patient preference information found its way in the label. Now, going back to pros and patient preferences together, they're different but complementary. A pro instrument reflects what actually happened to a patient on treatment. A preference study, at least a stated preference, there's something else called revealed preference, which I won't get into, but a stated preference survey reacts how patients believe they would react to a treatment. A pro can describe how patients felt to react to a treatment they experienced, but it won't work if it's for a treatment they haven't experienced. A patient preference study can be conducted with people who haven't used the treatment, even if it may not exist, which is one of the reasons it's used to assess commercial viability. But it's not going to tell us how people responded to a treatment, even if it's done in those who had it. Pro measures can be included as endpoints in trials. Preference surveys generally can't be, with that one exception I showed you, but it's not the same type of in-depth survey I showed you earlier. They're actually often conducted in panel outside trials. And from another complementary point of view, pro instrument development can actually inform the design of a preference study, particularly the concept elicitation part. And preference studies can actually inform some of the methods for scoring the pro instrument, so they can talk to one another. So where is this stuff going? Pauline, you can add, but patient-reported outcomes, in the past, they tended, I think, to be more exploratory endpoints, and it's changed. They're now moving more towards primary and secondary efficacy endpoints. Primary endpoints, for those who don't know, are the ones that define whether a trial succeeded or not. And there's going to be an updated guidance from the FDA in 2020 on patient-reported outcomes. The preferences are doing a lot of evolution from the regulatory, industry, and academic point of view. The CDRH, the FDA's devices group, put out the first guidance on preferences a few years back. A public-private consortium, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, developed a framework that supported that guidance. Now there are public-private partnerships, one called the Innovative Medicines Initiative, or IMI Prefer Project, which is developing the equivalent of guidances in preferences. There are quite a number of academic groups that are putting together requirements for regulatory quality work. So in parallel with this, a lot of core functions and companies are developing the expertise to do patient preference studies, in a sense catching up with what's happening on pro. Collectively, companies are increasingly turning to patients and patient groups to assess these growing regulatory requirements and patient group experiences for patient-focused drug development and pros and preferences in particular. So you put this together with the patient engagement movement, we're going to see a lot of growth on pros and preference information in development, regulatory approval, and post-approval studies. Well, Pauline and I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts. I know we're going to move over to questions now.
Thank you so much, Pauline and Bennett. We have a couple of questions that already came in, but I just wanted to provide a quick reminder to everybody that if you would like to submit a question, if you just look at your WebEx screen, at the bottom of the screen there's a little chat icon, and feel free to just submit a written question through the chat function. So Pauline and Bennett, we received this question. I only have so much time and money. Where should I put my resources? Which is more important to start with? Patient-reported outcomes or preferences?
It has to be in the context of your research objective. Outside the context of knowing what questions you want to address, we really can't answer that. There's certain questions which can only be answered with a pro. There's certain questions which can only be answered with a preference study. So the answer is to start by being very harsh about what it is you need to understand and when you need to have it assessed by.
And it also, just to add, I would have answered the question exactly the same way as that. It also depends on who you are, who's actually asking the question. As both Bennett and I talked about, the stakeholder, from the perspective of the stakeholder, they have different requirements of what it is that they're looking at. So you have to have a kind of an idea, a strategy, a plan what you're trying to do, and from there you can determine, well, what's the right path for me to take.
Thank you. Another question is, how might patient groups be involved in gathering data from members that can be used to develop PRO questionnaires?
Well, I can answer that we, Janssen, will oftentimes turn to patient organizations to help us find patients, recruit patients who can participate in our work when we are developing instruments, for example, as the question asks. So it is something that we do. So that's definitely a way that patient organizations can help us with the instrument development, and then as we go through the process of the different steps in developing an instrument, we get feedback along the way. And another place that patient organizations can help is being part of that feedback with regard to what it is that we're going to have. And then when we are done and we have data, we've been in various situations with patient advisory boards and so on, where we will be presenting the information and, again, getting the feedback from patient organizations and their level of interest in being able to help us figure out how can this information then be used within the limits of the law, of course, because if we have data that are a part of the label, then legally you can promote off of those. If they're not, and they're in a publication, then you can share publications.
Pauline, this is Eleanor Perfetto from the National Health Council. I wanted to add to what you had just said, because I agree with everything that you presented in terms of opportunities for patients to engage. I'm also thinking that some of the patient groups that are out there, even before there's a product that's the focus of a particular initiative, there's probably a lot of very kind of broader, generic kinds of work that might be taken on by a patient group that might want to learn more about what their patient group believes are the most important issues for them. So what are the most important outcomes when it comes to their illness or when it comes to a desirable treatment? And those are general kinds of questions that, when in the course of an organization having, putting a survey together or something that they might normally do, it might be some survey work among their membership, they might be able to ask those kinds of questions in general so that they're able to communicate that information to some of the sponsors or innovators who might be looking for this kind of information. And that could actually help jumpstart a lot of thinking without that work having to be done from scratch. There's something to build off of. Absolutely, Eleanor, and as if you want to be just product agnostic, so to speak, as we now enter an era where the FDA has, started looking at the core sets of measures that can be developed, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that will be happening as we, pick or they choose particular disease areas to be looking at and figuring out, well, what is it that's important, and getting that kind of information without thinking of any particular product.
That's true on the preference side as well. There are actually a number of patient groups that have collaborated with academia and conducted preference studies that have been important. Parent-pregnant muscular dystrophy has done several. Longevity has done this in lung cancer, JDRF in diabetes. The Michael J. Fox Foundation has completed, now publishing, some fascinating work they did with MIT and the Medical Device Innovation Council that may change the way we calculate statistical significance in trials by accounting for patient preferences. And all these were done outside the context of a particular treatment. They can help set up for preferences for when a drug company is actually working on a particular treatment or device.
Thank you. Bennett, here's a question for you is, what will I be asked to do when I participate in a patient preference study?
Well, it'll depend on the methodology, but if we use the one I showed, the discrete choice, it'll always begin with informed consent, an explanation of what you'll be asked to do, and you can opt out. Then it'll begin by setting up what is the vignette, the problem. Why are we doing this? What type of questions you'll be asked? And it'll start to gradually give you information about what are the benefits and harms you'll be asked about. Typically, it'll be done with graphics and little micro tests to reinforce your understanding. At some point, it'll switch from training to the actual choice task. And you might have 10 different versions of that Alzheimer's example I showed you, where there'll be different benefits and different harms traded off, and you'll say which you prefer, no treatment or that particular treatment. There may be a couple of close-down questions for demographics or background and education. These typically will take between 15 minutes and a half hour, depending on the size and complexity of the survey.
Thank you. An additional question that came in is, for a drug, which FDA functional reviewer will assess the PRO data? So thinking about a submission to FDA, what types of people will be involved at the FDA in terms of reviewing PRO data in a submission?
Well, as best I understand it from not being part of the FDA, the review division is responsible for the review overall. And so they will have people within the review division, but the review division will normally turn to the COA group within the FDA to get their help and expertise in reviewing the PROs as well. So I would recommend that you Google FDA multidiscipline review document that Bennett showed the table, the patient experience table from it. And if you go to one of those documents that has some kind of a COA, PRO included in it, you will find they're typically going to be long documents, a couple of hundred pages, but if you look in the table of contents and there have been PROs included, you will find often an appendix towards the back that will have the COA group's review, and they can be very informative and instructive. And it's actually another place to go for people to be able to find information, for patients, patient organizations to be looking for information. A lot of it is fairly technical, but a lot of it's fairly easy to read through as well and get the overall messages. So the COA group plays a large role, assuming that the division brings them in, which they do more and more.
Thank you, Pauline. One clarifying question, and I can also, refer that one of our previous webinars to respond to this question is Clinical Outcome Assessment Series, Untangling the Terms. But just briefly, the clarifying question was, what is the maximum number of PROs you should include in a questionnaire?
That's going to depend on your setting up your trial and the statistical hierarchy with regard to, if you include the PROs into your statistical hierarchy. That's one piece of it, but maybe the question is also trying to get at the question of the burden on people who are responding. And so, clearly you have to take into account the fact that you have people with particular diseases or conditions who are responding to these questions, and that you don't overburden them. But one of the things that we have found is that patients many times really appreciate the inclusion of questions in a PRO instrument that ask them about how they feel and function, and really welcome it, and feedback that we've we've gotten is that they are happy that they're able to provide that information and that it is being used. So I think there's two sides to that question, and I'm not exactly sure where it was coming from.
In the past, almost all of these pros and preference studies were done on paper, which meant it had to be done those rare opportunities when a patient came to a clinic. So you could imagine if you had a lot of instruments, you could have the patient spend hours filling out paper, get exhausted, and then would lower the quality of the responses as they get tired. Now that pros and preferences are done electronically, it's possible for people to do these at home when they're refreshed. So it actually does increase the amount of work number of studies such studies you can add to a clinical trial. But the burden issue is really important. If you exhaust your patients and tire them out, you're not going to get quality data, and they might even want to leave the study.
Great, thank you. And then maybe just two more questions. So one of the questions is, how can patient organizations help in the proliferation of well-designed PRO and patient preference studies?
One approach is to actually collaborate with an academic group or sometimes with a member of industry to conduct and help design a preference study that's really important. Current Project Muscular Dystrophy was frustrated that medical decisions were being made to prevent side effects that the children with muscular dystrophy would not live long enough to have. They realized that the way to think about this was very different than the way physicians were thinking about it. So they worked with an academic group, and they made a real difference. They actually did such a good job on benefit, risk, and preference work that they were afforded the opportunity to draft the guidance that got slightly modified but was in good part adopted by the FDA. Now, the preference didn't happen to make its way into the guidance, but it's part of the whole picture. Michael J. Fox's Foundation's work on preference is leading to a large number of publications and a large number of presentations, and it's getting a lot of attention because it's a novel way of applying preferences to regulatory decisions.
And I would just add to that, what I had talked about earlier with regard to when the PRO instrument is being developed, particularly I'm thinking about rare diseases where it's hard to find patients to participate in that qualitative research. So being able to partner with the appropriate patient organizations for some of those rare diseases, we have found to be not just helpful, but really necessary.
I would second that. There are certain diseases where it's very hard to recruit, especially if the nature of the disease makes it very difficult to do these activities. So working with patient groups can make a tremendous difference in finding people who are willing to help design the research and participate in it.
Great, thank you. So if we could actually just go to the next slide, please. I want to make sure that I am able to announce, the practice exercises. We're still here. I guess we'll just have to skip them for now. But if we could go to the next slide, I just want to make the announcement that our next webinar will be on May 14th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be on lessons learned from a patient group's experience developing a PRO. And it will feature Dory Krantz from the National Alopecia Areata Foundation. So stay tuned for updates on that. We will be posting information to our website and also following us by email. I also wanted to just quickly make the point that during our last webinar, we've had a number of technical issues, and so we've posted a new version of that online. If folks are interested, we were able to fix the sound problems, and so there will be a better version available for that. But I'd just like to thank our speakers today, Pauline and Bennett. This has been wonderful and so informative. A recording of the webinar will be posted onto our website within the next few days or so, and we look forward to having everybody back on May 14th. Thank you.